All right, so today's session is an introduction to Report Writer, and it's the last session for this series, this Training Tuesday series of webinars. So I'm glad to see a good group today, and I know some of you have attended every session, so I really appreciate that. So today is Introduction to Report Writer. After the session, you should be comfortable with at least understanding what the product does or what the product capabilities are. You should also have a basic understanding of how to code a report and an understanding of Report Designer. Two totally different pieces of the report architecture, but we'll cover both, and you should at least have a basic understanding of both of them. The Report Writer has its own week-long course. So in this session today, which will be probably about an hour, 15, hour and a half, we won't be able to, of course, cover the entire course, just a few basics, but as you can imagine, there's an awful lot we won't have time to cover in today's session, but we'll do the best we can. Our agenda today, it probably will be over an hour today. Just looking at the number of PowerPoint slides I have to get through, it looks like we have about 34 slides or so. And then I did want to show you some things right there in studio as well, so a few small demonstrations and get you familiar with the resources we have available for you to continue your education with Report Writer. So I'll point those out. We've got some videos, we've got some studio help documentation, and I'll show those to you as well before we leave today. So as usual, if you need to leave, you can leave at any time and come back and rejoin the session. It won't bother anybody here. We will record the session, and I'll send a link to everyone. Or actually, I don't think I've been sending the link out lately. What we've been doing is just adding that link to the online registration page. So the place where you would normally go to sign up for a session, you'll notice that the link for the session we just finished has been changed so that you can watch the recording. So that's one place that you can click to watch a recorded session. We also have been putting the sessions in our online video training on our website. I'll show you those at the end of the session so you can see them there as well. So two different places you can get access to the recording. If you have any questions for me, most of you by now are familiar with the chat interface in the control panel, so you can send me a question that way. I'm not too good about checking it as the session's going on because there's too many other things to keep up with, but I do try to check it last thing before the session closes. So if I don't have time to answer your question during the session, I'll send you an email later to get you the answer if I need to. You can also send me a question by email if you want to, lchildress@4js.com. So if it's something you think of later, feel free to send me an email, and I will get back with you. Here's our interface. This is the Go to Training interface that I think most of us are pretty familiar with by now. It has a control panel you can see here on the right, and then over on the left side of our screen there's the viewing area where you'll see the PowerPoint slides or the studio interface, whatever we happen to be looking at during the session. Here's a larger view of the control panel, so you can see that you can choose between using the microphone and speakers on your computer. And if you have problems with that, we also have a telephone option. I noticed a few folks have logged into the session today using telephone for speakers and mic instead of the computer. So you can do that. If you click on the radio button, it should give you a phone number that you can use to call in. There's the raise hand icon that I was asking for earlier. So if anything important comes up, like we lose sound, for example, my audio has a problem, feel free to raise that hand, and that's pretty good about getting my attention. There's the mute button. But we don't really need the mute button in these sessions because I go ahead and mute everyone before the session starts, just because we do have a tendency to get a lot of feedback for some reason when I have you unmuted. All right, so First introductory page here about Report Writer. Genero Report Writer is a graphical reporting suite that has three components, three basic components. We've got the reporting engine that's kind of the workhorse for Report Writer that provides streaming of the data that's being extracted from the database or file for the report data. And it also provides all the layouting. So that's, I guess you could call that the workhorse of the Genero Report Writer product. We also have a Report Designer component for Report Writer that provides a GUI graphical report design area that you can use to design reports. It's integrated with Studio, but you can also install that as a standalone product as well. We'll be looking at it today integrated with Studio. And then the last component is the Report Viewer that's actually part of the desktop client, the Genero Desktop Client or GDC. And you can use, of course, the Report Viewer to view the output of a report. It's especially helpful, I think, when you're working on reports. A lot of times I'll run the report and view it in Report Viewer just to get an idea whether it looks like I think it looks like. But Report Viewer is good for looking at the output of the report or even users viewing the report when it's in a certain format, SVG format. So there's the three basic components, the report engine, the report designer, and report viewer. And with Report Writer, you can create a variety of reports. You can create simple list reports. You can create customized formats like invoices, and includes all kinds of graphics with those reports if you want to. It provides for labels, so you can print labels with Report Writer if you want to. And we also provide a lot of different types of business graphs, map charts, category charts, all types of business graphs. It supports a variety of different output formats. You can, of course, send a report to the printer. You can view the report right there with Report Viewer. You can also save it as a file in various formats like XML or HTML and view them as that type of a document. You can save them as PDFs or image files if you want to. You can even output to an Excel spreadsheet, as we see here. So lots of different formats and a lot of different output options for reports with Report Writer. We have several pages on Report Writer architecture, but the big idea that we'll see when we discuss the architecture is that it provides for a separation of roles. So we actually have at least two different files involved with reports, and that's part of what allows a separation of roles. We have a BDL, or a file with code in it, a 4GL file, that actually has BDL code that's used to extract the data and provide all the grouping and ordering and that type of thing. So a programmer does that part, but then the actual report design can be done by, let's say, a business user or a power user. So the way the architecture has been designed allows for that separation of duties. So it's nice to be able to have power users or business users that can create their own reports, and that separates the duties from programming. You don't have to be a programmer to design a report. The architecture also provides what we call streaming architecture, and what they're referring to there is as soon as we get some output, as soon as we're able to extract a page of data, we can go ahead and start viewing that data or viewing that process data as soon as it's available. So we don't have to wait for, let's say, an entire 200-page report to finish processing and formatting before the end user can actually see some results. So that's what they mean by streaming architecture. Immediate results means we can start viewing the report as soon as there's some data available. We don't have to wait for the whole thing to finish. Along with that, Report Writer doesn't require any temp tables. That, of course, reduces the amount of disk space and memory that it uses. So it makes it good for large enterprise reporting environments. It doesn't require temporary tables. It uses less memory, less disk space. So it's good for large enterprise type reports. XML standards. Just about everything we talk about here, except maybe the BDL 4GL code, is in XML. The actual data stream is formatted in XML format. The report design document that you create in Report Designer is saved in XML format. And if you use Report Viewer and view the report in SVG output, then that is also in XML. So we use XML as our standard. And the big benefit to that is portability, of course, and also we can have multiple views of the same data. It can be output to a lot of different formats, as we saw on the previous page. We have all those different options for output. And the gathering of data is separate from the layout. So again, we've got a BDL program that we use that's very similar to, let's say, Informix legacy type reports, if you're familiar with those. And then we have a separate component that's our report design document that has our actual report layout in it. So that means that I can write one BDL program to actually extract the data that I want to use for reports, but then I can use that same BDL program to actually generate multiple different report formats or different report designs. We have one page here that tells a little bit about what Report Writer is not good at. We've been talking about a lot of the features for Report Writer that make it a good Report Writer product to use for large enterprise reports, and some of the benefits to separating out the components the way we do into a report engine and a report designer. But here we have also some information about what Report Writer is not good at. This red oval represents the Report Writer product here, and you can see that on this axis going out this way that there's a few things that that oval doesn't cover, specifically slice and dice capabilities here and data mining. And the reason that Report Writer is not really a great product for those two types of reports is because of the architecture. Remember, a minute ago we talked about extracting the data and then sending that data to the report engine so it can do the formatting and the layouting based on a report design document. So by the time the data gets to the layouting phase with the report design document, the data has already been extracted, right? The data definition or the SQL statements to actually extract the data have already been written in the BDL program. So it doesn't work very well as a slice and dice or data mining type report because of that. The designer can only act on data that's already been streamed across, right, by the BDL program. So here's the first page of several that we have on the architecture. I'll try not to drag it out too much. I'll try to be fairly brief. But here's kind of an overview slide of the architecture. And we can see over here we have a data source that can be a database like we have in this picture, but it could also be a file, like an XML file, or it could be just a regular data file, like a file that's been created with, let's say, an unload statement to unload a database table, for example. So just about any type of a file can be used as a data source or a database. And then over here, it's talking about the Genero dynamic virtual machine. The runner for Genero takes this BDL report, the 4GL document that the programmer creates, and executes the BDL in it, and that's the part that actually extracts the data from the data source. And then that data gets streamed to the report engine. And then over here on this side of the slide we've got the Genero report engine That's the GRE component we see here. Up here at the top, we've got the Report Designer. And when you use Report Designer to create a document, it creates something that they refer to as a report design document that ends with a .4RP for report. And the runtime system streams the data over to the report engine, and it's responsible for taking that report design document, that .4RP, and kind of merging it in with the data stream and doing all the layouting. So that's the job of the report engine. So it takes the XML data stream, formats it according to this design document, the .4RP, and then goes ahead and streams that data to whatever output device you've selected in your report settings. Again, that design document that you create in Report Designer has all the settings for the report. It's got the report layout, but it also has paper settings, output settings, all those type of things as well. So the report engine streams the data to whatever output device that's been selected in that report. And again, you can view the report if it's in SVG format with the General Report Viewer, which we see here. That's the GRV. But you can also output it to a printer or a file in one of those formats we talked about on the first or second page. So that's an overall look at the architecture. And here we're focusing in on the first component here. So here it's talking about the BDL program that the programmer writes that actually produces the XML data stream. These BDL report programs are very similar to Informix report programs. So I know some of you come from an Informix background and you're familiar with Informix reports. There's a report block, for example, just like you see in the old legacy Informix reports. So it looks very similar. We'll look at them in detail a little bit later. So we're going to use BDL to produce this XML data stream. That'll be one basic difference from an old legacy report and a BDL report. And then that BDL is going to extract the data from whatever source we choose. And again, it doesn't have to be an Informix database, right? It can be any database that Generos supports. And then we're going to stream that data in XML format over to the report engine. So one of the things that we are going to include in this BDL file are some special classes and methods that we use to actually create that XML formatted data stream. So we'll see those here in a few minutes. Here they're just talking about the report block in the program. It looks just about like any other report block you might have worked with in the past. It's responsible for accepting the data from the driver part of the report, specifies the order in which the data was sorted, and then it's responsible for actually outputting the data. So that report block is pretty similar to any report block you might have worked with legacy reports, except that there's not a lot of formatting in it, right? Most of the formatting is done in the design document. Here we're moving on to the report designer component up here at the top. And we already said that one of the components to Report Writer is a special graphical report designer that's integrated in Studio. So again, you can install it as a standalone option if you want to, but it comes with Studio, and that's where we'll look at it a little bit later. So you can use this graphical tool to design your reports instead of having to code it in a 4GL program. A little more visual. I think that makes it easier to design. It's considered to be near WYSIWYG. It's almost what you see is what you get. There's a few exceptions that we'll talk about in a few pages, but you can use this special editor, this GUI editor, to design your report. And again, that helps with the separation of roles. So we have a BDL programmer that writes the BDL portion of the report, and then we can have an end user, like a power user or a business user, that can actually design the actual report designs. Here they're talking about the report engine in a little more detail. We already have discussed the idea that the report engine is kind of the workhorse of Report Writer, and his job is to take this XML data stream that's coming from the source and use this report design document that we create with Report Designer and actually handle the layouting. So here it's saying we've got these two inputs. We've got the report design document and we've got the XML data stream, and that's what the report engine uses to create our formatted report. And the report engine, of course, is responsible for the layouting, which means he's calculating where to position objects, how to render them, and it's saying that report engine typically runs on a server, just like your application server or a database server. And then finally, the last component of the architecture down here at the end is the General Report Viewer. So we talked a bit about Report Viewer a minute ago. We can use the General Report Viewer to view reports that have the output set to the SVG format type. What is that? Scalable Vector Graphics, I think, is what SVG stands for. Sometimes I can remember that, sometimes I can't. But if you're using that type of output, you can use the Report Viewer to view the output. Otherwise, if you've chosen to store it as a file, like a PDF format, you can use Adobe to view a PDF report. If you've stored it in an image format, you can use an Image Viewer to view the report. And it's also pointing out that if you save the report as an image, you can also turn around and embed it into an application if you want to. So one thing I guess to make clear here is that the only type of reports that you can actually view in Report Viewer are these reports that are formatted in SVG, or you've chosen to output them to SVG format. And that's what Report Viewer is for. One more thing to talk about before we move out of the architecture slides is that when a power user or a business user is designing a new report, he has to see what data elements are available, right, before he can drag and drop data items into his developing form that he's creating. And the way he does that is by using a special file that gets created by the programmer. Now, there's a couple of ways you can create this file, but the easiest way is to have it created automatically. Every time you compile your new BDL report, you can have it automatically create this special RDD file. The proper name for the RDD file is data schema file, or sometimes data definition file. You hear it referred to 2 or 3 different ways, but most people just call it the RDD file because it has an extension of .rdd. That's where we get that name. So, special file that actually gets used inside of Report Designer so that the person designing the report knows what data items, like what columns are being extracted from the database, what data is available, and can actually drag and drop column data or file data onto the report from that, they call it the data view. So this RDD file gets implemented as what they call the data view in Report Designer. And we'll see a good screenshot of that soon. So that's essential. Before the Report Designer can actually add data items to the report, that RDD file has to be generated from the BDL report. So that's where it comes from. Okay, so the overall report process, we'll take a look at it and then we'll go through it kind of step by step in our PowerPoint slides. So the first step, just like writing any type of program, is to determine what your requirements are. For reports, you'd be interested in what data you need to extract. Is there any special grouping that's going to be required from the data? any special ordering that you want to do, those types of things. Once you've determined what your requirements are, you'll want to go ahead and organize the project workspace and create a good environment for working with reports. Then you're ready to create your 4GL, right, the application that actually extracts the data from the data source. And again, it's written in BDL, so it will have a .4GL extension. It has the report driver and a report block, and of course you'll need a main as well, just like you would with any program. And we also provide a wizard. There's a data wizard that we'll take a look at that actually will do most of the work for you. It will create, for example, the report driver and the report block for you. Now, it doesn't do quite everything. For example, the data wizard won't do the main, and it won't have these mandatory reporting API functions that are required. We'll see here in a minute or two. But it will create, for example, the SQL to extract the data, and it will create the report block for you. So it does most of the work. So once you have your 4GL, your report application written, you'll need to make sure that you generate this RDD file, the schema file that they need to use in Report Designer. One way to do that, if you're using Studio, is just to add this --build--RDD to the compiler options property. We'll see how to do that in a minute or two. And that way it's automatic. Every time we compile the application, it'll automatically generate this fresh RDD file for Report Designer to use. And then you're ready to create the report designs. A programmer can do it, of course, or based on the architecture, we've designed it so that a non-programmer can do it. So if you have a power user or a business user, somebody that understands data pretty well, maybe has an understanding of data types and grouping, that person does need to know some basics about those types of things. What you hear is that anybody that's pretty familiar with Excel and can write Excel formulas, figure out how to extract data from a database with Excel, those types of people are pretty well equipped to write, to design documents with Report Designer. So that's the type of understanding they need to have. Then you can run the report application, of course, once you've designed it and created the BDL. And again, depending on the output type, if it's SVG type output that you've selected, you can view the report in Report Viewer. Now, a moment ago we went through the report process, so once you've gone through and determined your report requirements, then you're ready to go ahead and organize your project workspace. Now, there's a lot of different ways you could organize your project workspace, but you'll want to go in, for example, and possibly create a new workspace for reports to kind of isolate them from other things to make them easier to work with and easier to view. So here they're talking about creating a new project, at least, for reports. And you can do that by using the File, New, Simple Project option from the Files, General Files category. And then you'll want to create your application nodes. If you have libraries you need to include, you can add those library nodes and possibly some virtual folders as well. So if you look at the example here in the screenshot, you can see that they've created a new workspace for reports up here, separate them out from their other projects. They do have a database library node here because it looks like at least some of their reports will be extracting data from a database. Here's their application node, or one application node that they created for reports, and they've created a couple of virtual folders here. One for the actual BDL code, the 4GLs, for example, and then they've got an additional virtual folder for the report design documents, the .4RPs, just to keep them separated out. And again, it's because you might have different people working on those two different types of files, so it's kind of nice to separate them to see what designs are available versus mixing it all in with the application notes or with the 4GLs. So some kind of report project structure is good. It doesn't have to be exactly like this, but some way for you to easily work with your reports. Uh-oh, hit the wrong button there. 1 second. There we go. All right. So once you have your project structure created that you want to use for reports, the next step that we talked about was to actually create the report application. So here we're talking about the BDL, the .4GL application. So a simple 4GL report, these are the components you'd need to have. There's a type definition. Report typically starts with a user-defined type. The idea is to have a single record that has all the fields from all the reference tables, or contains all the data from all the files that you're going to use. So a type definition needs to be in the report. It does need to include, of course, the report driver that specifies the data to be extracted. Reports have a report program block that have control blocks. Again, a lot of the information we normally see in for control blocks we don't really use with our report writer BDL programs. We do most of the formatting, for example, in the report design document, but we still use control blocks. They're just more simple. And then, of course, the report block is responsible for sending the data to the report engine. And this 4GL program, the BDL, is going to need to include some mandatory reporting API functions. This is the part of the code that we use, for example, to create that XML data stream. So we'll take a look at those. So step by step here, here's the type definition. You'll notice before the type definition, of course, if you're extracting the data from a database, you'll still need your schema statement up here above the type definition. And then we have the type defined here. So here we're defining a user type that consists of a single record that has all the records, all the fields, all the data from all of our tables. So an easy way to do it is just specify it like we do here. Customer record like customer.star. And we're also going to extract data from the state table. So we're just creating a state record with our user-defined type, like the state table, state.star. And the whole idea with creating this type definition is to allow the record to be specified once, and then from that time on, all we have to do is use the name of the type in the program anytime we want to use that record or work with that record. You've probably worked with these user types before. They're not exclusive to reports. Now here's the main, and here is the first place where we can see some of these special classes and methods that we use for reports. Grab my highlighter here. So here notice that we're using a special built-in class called om.saxDocumentHandler. And then we're creating an object of that type called handler. So there we are setting up our variables. So this handler object is going to be an XML handler, and that's what we use to actually stream the data in XML format from the data source to the report engine. So that's what we're using that SAX document handler for. Again, this report's going to be extracting data from the database, so we have a database statement here. And then here is this first, whoa, really went wild there. This is a mandatory reporting function here, FGO report load current settings. So right here, this is where it's going to take the report design document that we want to specify for this report and read the report design document and use this method, this function actually, this function to configure the report engine. Right? So this is where it loads all these settings from the report design document. And then we're creating our XML handler with that next statement, let handler equal FGL report commit current settings. So that's actually what creates that XML handler that the report engine is going to use, and then associates that handler with our variable that we defined up above. So now we have an XML handler. Now when we use that function, it's going to return a Boolean. Right, so it'll be true if it was able to successfully load the settings and false if it's not able to load the settings. So if it's not able to load the settings, we're going to exit the program. Right, we failed for some reason. But if we are able to load the settings correctly or safely, then we're going to go ahead and call a function. And the name of this function happens to be run store list to handler. And then we're, of course, passing that function a reference to our newly created XML handler. So there's the main. It's got a lot of these special mandatory reporting API functions. So the big idea there, just an overview, is to get our report settings from our report design document and actually configure those with the report engine. Because remember, the report engine is going to be responsible for laying out the report using that design document. And here's the report driver. So we're just moving down a little bit here. Here's the function that we just called in the main a few minutes ago. It was called run store list to handler in our example here. And notice here we're using our type definition that we set up a few minutes ago. Since we passed a reference to our XML handler to this function, we have to define a variable for that here in the function. And just like any other report driver, here we're actually putting in the BDL code to extract the data. And of course this example is using a database, so it's declaring and using a cursor to retrieve the data. And it looks like we're ordering by state code and then store number. And this is just a continuation of the report driver. It's too big to put on one page and really look at, so we extend it over onto another page. So here we're looking at the actual report block. Oops, sorry, not yet. I saw the capital report. I usually think report block. This is still the driver. It's getting ready to send data to the report block. So start report. Here we're sending the report data to our XML handler. So this is what's going to create our XML data stream. And then we're just using our cursor, looping through the data, and then sending one record at a time to that report block. And then when we're finished, we're going to close the cursor. Now we're looking at our report block that we were sending that data to. So here's the report block. And again, we're using our type definition here. This order external by is what informs the report how the output was sorted or will be sorted when the data is extracted. So of course this goes right along with our order by that we had in our report driver. And then there's our format block. And this one's pretty simple. We're just using an on every row that specifies what action the runtime system should take for every record passed to the report definition, and then we're just printing out every record, right? So for every row we're going to print the record. You can also specify, of course, some other control blocks that you want to specify. You can specify like first page header, you can specify before and after group of, on last row. All of those types of control blocks are available as well. This is just a simple example. Now something that we have to do here is include a special library. All of those mandatory reporting API functions that we looked at in the main are compiled in compiled files that are part of a library. And you can see the name of the library here in this screenshot, libgre.42x. So we have to include that in our application. So in Studio, if we select our report application node, this application node here is called List Report 1, and then we go to the properties for that application node. There's an external dependencies property, and we need to be sure and add that special library with these reporting API functions that we need to use in it. Notice there's no path that we have to specify, just the name of the library. All right, so here we've created the report and done all the things we need for the actual BDL application, the .4GL. And here we're getting ready to actually design the report document. But we said before we can actually design the report document and add data items or data elements to the design, we have to first create the special schema or data definition file. We just kind of the casual name for it is the RDD file because it has an RDD extension. So here we're talking about actually creating that RDD file. Now we could do it from the command line with FGL-comp, right? They're talking about that here, but from within Studio we can just add this add space dash dash build dash RDD to our compiler options. So again, it's in the properties. This time it's in the properties for the 4GL file that has the report block. So you need to make sure and select that particular source file, .4GL file, to add these compiler options to. And then every time that file with the report block in it gets compiled, it'll automatically create this special schema file, the .RDD file, that we need for Report Designer. So I think we could kind of call those things housekeeping, right? Adding the library to the application node, creating the RDD file entries in the properties for the report block 4GL file. I would kind of consider those little housekeeping tasks we have to do. I mentioned earlier that you don't actually have to code the BDL for the report from scratch. There is a wizard called a Report Data Wizard that will walk you through with several different dialog screens through the actual data selection from a database. So if you're selecting data or extracting data from a database, you can use the Report Data Wizard. And it does create most of the 4GL application you need. The report driver, the report block are all included, but you will have to go back in and create the main block, those mandatory API, report API functions we saw earlier. You'll have to put those in. You'll have to add those. The compiler options we just saw on the previous page to generate the RDD file, you'll need to do that. So there's a few things that this data wizard doesn't do, but it does save you a lot of coding if you're extracting data from a database. So you can use it to define the tables, the joins, the columns that you want to include, order by, grouping, all kinds of things. We'll take a look at that a little bit later when we look at Studio. All right, now we're going to take a look at the Report Designer component of Report Writer to create the report design document. So the Genero Report Designer, that's GRD, it's the default tool to edit these report design documents that end with a .4RP. So we typically just call them .4RP files, and we can do that right there from within Genero Studio. To get into Report Designer, there's a multitude of ways to open it up. If it's a new report, you're just starting to work with Report Designer, from the top menu you can go to File, New, and then there's a Reports category inside there that you can select, and then select Report from Database, for example, or select a template. You can also just say File, Open, and if you have an existing .4RP that you've already been working on, you get the option to browse for it and find it that way in your directory structure. Within the project view, if you have an existing report design document, you can just double-click on it to open up Report Designer and have that report selected. Right-click on a .4RP file, and there's an Open option in the context menu. Just a multitude of ways. Right-click on an application, library, virtual folder node, and select New File, Empty Report. Or you can do the same process here. Click an application, library, or virtual folder node, New File, Templates, and then you can select an available template to use. Those templates provide a bit of a shortcut for creating a new report design document so that you don't have to just create everything from scratch. So here's what Report Designer looks like if you've never worked with it. Of course, we've got this main work area. I think I'll use a pen this time. Right, here's this main work area here in the middle, and it's surrounded by what they call dockable views, like the report structure view, the property views. Those are all dockable views, meaning that you can double-click on them, for example, and they'll pop out as a separate box, and then you can click on that box and drag it around until you find some place you like better for it, and then you can drop that view back into the structure again if you want to, in a place you like a little bit better. When you drop it in, it gets created as a tabbed panel. If you don't want it to be a tabbed panel, while you're moving it around, you can wait for a space appear. It'll show a space, and then you can drop it into a space, and then it will look like we see here in this example, right, where it's not a tabbed view. We have Report Structure View opened up, and we have the Properties View as well opened up down here at the bottom. So that's what they mean by dockable views. You can double-click those, and they pop out. You can move them around and put them somewhere different. You can also close them. If you're not using them for the moment, you can certainly close them. You can go up to Window, and under Windows there's a Views option where you can, it's like a toggle where you can select a view or deselect it by clicking on it. You can also, of course, close a view by just selecting the X in the corner. And then if you need it again later, you can go up to Window, Views, and add it back again. We mentioned earlier that the Report Designer is near WYSIWYG View. It's not exactly what you see is what you get. There's a few exceptions. One of them is if you have repeated detail items. For example, a report like a list report where you're just listing out for a bunch of order information or customer information. It doesn't actually show all those repeated detail items, just the first one. So that's one exception. Another one is the order isn't page header, then detail, then footer, like you would see in an actual printed report. Because of some of the rules of Report Writer, it's necessary for the page header and the footer to be at the top of the WYSIWYG type view, and then the detail goes below the footer if you use a footer. And then, of course, just like any other visual editor, you can grab objects and drag and drop them in your main work area here, and then move them around to place them where you want them to design your report. We have a toolbox with Report Designer, so we've got a few pages here on the toolbox. When you get ready to design a report, you start your design by dragging and dropping containers. You can see there's a lot of containers over here in the toolbox, and it reminds me a lot of Form Designer, right? When you design a new form, you use containers for your layouting so that you can arrange things just like you want them in the form, and it's a very similar thing here for Report Designer. The toolbox has a variety of containers for report objects, and you drag and drop these containers from the toolbox into the work area and then arrange them however you like to create your report page. And then once you have at least your basic containers in place, you can start designing your report. You can add other report elements, like there's things called word boxes that you see here that just contain text. If it's a lot of text and it might have too much text in it to fit in a word box, you can use a wrap box so it wraps around. There's special formatting boxes for numerics that you can use. So all kinds of other types of objects that you can place inside these containers to do your layouting like you want it. And then down here you can see there's business graphs that you can use, barcodes, all kinds of different tools in the toolbox. Now what we don't see here is actual data elements that you can drag and drop into the report area. And the reason for that is because the data elements are in a different view. We'll see those in just a minute. Now notice also that once you drag and drop an object like a container or a word box into a report, just like we have with Form Designer, there's properties. So you can go and edit that object's properties in the property view. You can see that Toolbox is broken out into logical groups, drawables, propagating containers, which means that if one fills up, it'll automatically create another one. That's what propagating means for containers. And it tries to arrange these groups, the most commonly used groups at the top, right? So the more commonly used objects at the top and then working their way down. So a little information here about some of these containers. There's a lot of containers and we don't have time to go through all of them and discuss them, but we'll hit some of the biggies here. There's a container called a mini page, right? So a mini page is used for the main container, the basic container for a report page called page root, appropriately enough. But you can also create additional mini pages. You can see here that you can grab these and drag and drop them onto your report work area. So they recommend a mini page is used for the main container of the report. And if you use a template, one of the things you'll notice that they already have that page root mini container already there in a template. So they've already done some of the work for you. But if you create a new empty report, they recommend you select a mini page for page root. If you're going to have a report page, like let's say the first page of report is going to be different than the rest of the pages for the report, that you use a mini page for that. And for mini pages, the default layout direction is top to bottom. Now, one of the properties for a mini page is the layout direction. So if you don't want it to be from top to bottom, you can actually change it. For example, you can make the layout direction from left to right if you like for particular layout that you're doing. There are also vertical boxes that you can select. Right, so here's up here in our toolbox, there's vertical boxes, there's simple ones, and then there's propagating vertical boxes. And of course that's for things that you want to lay out in your report vertically. So you might use vertical boxes for page headers and footers. The direction for vertical boxes, of course, being vertical, is top to bottom. And one more toolbox container that we'll look at, because it's used a lot, are stripes. And a stripe is just really a mini page with the y-axis set to maximum. And they recommend that you use stripe containers for table rows. And of course, the layout direction is from left to right. So there's a few of the containers that are very commonly used designing a report in Report Designer. Now this page root, we'll see that when we look at our structure view for a report. Where'd it go? There it is up at the top. The page root is just a mini page, and the idea there is everything is maxed out, right? So all the coordinates are at their max, so that it goes all the way from the top to the bottom. Now here's the data view that we've been talking about. This is the reason that we have to create this RDD file or schema file, is for the report designer data view. So here we have a better screenshot so you can actually see the data view, except it's awful small so it makes it hard to see. There it is down at the bottom, and we've selected that data view for the screenshot, and you can see here that here's all of our grouping that was done in our BDL file, right? So remember, all this information in the RDD file comes from the BDL report, right? The 4GL report. So it goes and examines, in this case, the SQL in that BDL report, and uses the SQL statements and the order by clauses to create this special RDD file. And then whenever we create the report design, we actually pull in this RDD file so that it is visible here in the data view. So it formats it here so it's easy to read. So this shows us what's coming from the 4GL in the BDL report, the grouping structures here, the report triggers, and then variables that were used in the BDL report. And of course, just like we can containers from the toolbox, we can drag and drop data items, data elements from the data view over to our working area of the report, and then arrange them however we like inside these containers that we talked about a minute ago. So here's a bit more information about the data view. Some of these icons at the top, for example, and exactly what those mean. Grab a highlighter. So they're referring to these icons across the top of the data view. So one thing you can see over here is sample data. So they're actually starting with the sample data. So they have some default sample data that is automatically used with the data view that's based on the data type. So you can use the defaults that you see here, like foobar, for example, is the default sample data used for customer or character data types. Integers, they're using the value 42. And you can actually change those defaults if you want to by clicking on them and editing them if you want to make them more realistic for your report. But that's the sample data. So if you want to view the report and see a better idea of what it will look like, you can see it with the sample data. And the way to do that is while you're designing the report, if you look up here in the toolbar, this little icon up in the top, the little bluish icon, if you click on that, that will change it to the sample data view. So you can view what the sample data looks like versus just the header information like titles or captions or data values. So you can toggle back and forth. The arrows right here change the sort order. By default, the sort order is based on the table data, but if you want to, you can click on those arrows and it will sort it alphabetically. So if you prefer alphabetical sorting, you can use the arrows. Now these other icons across the top, I've got a screenshot of it here, changes the default values given to variables when you drag and drop them into the work area. Now we'll talk more about those later, but the idea there is when you get ready to drag some sort of data element over to the main work area, you use these icons to specify what exactly it is you're wanting to drag and drop. Do you want to drag over, for example, the value of the column? For example, let's say it's store number, and I'm dragging and dropping this store number data element into my work area. Do I actually want to drop the store number title or caption, store num, or do I actually want to drag and drop the store number value, like maybe it's store number 15 or store number 16? I use these icons at the top to specify whether I want the actual value of the data item or whether I want the caption or title for the data item. And there's different icons for data from a database, right? Tables from a database, or data items from a file. And that's the reason there's so many of them. This last icon at the very end is specifying that it comes from a table, but you don't want to include the headers or captions for them. Again, we'll see that again later. So it does change the default values, the width, depending on whether you're dragging over the actual value or just the caption or title. It sizes them appropriately. If you don't like the name of the variables, right, they're data, dot, customer, dot, address to, you can actually change the names of these variables that you see in the data view by changing the 4GL, right, the BDL code. So you can actually use a printx statement and specify the naming conventions that you want to use for the variables. Make them a little more user-friendly is the idea. I believe this is the last component of Report Designer that we're looking at, and maybe the most important component of Report Designer is the Report Structure View. Now, the Report Structure View is used to tell the report design exactly how you want things printed out, like the order that you want things printed out. For example, you can specify that when one of these triggers is activated, like this group store num trigger, perhaps you want to print some output every time the store number changes. You can use the report structure view to add a child to this group store number node in the tree, and then it will go ahead and print out, let's say, a line of information every time the store number changes. So that's part of the idea for the report structure view, is to specify exactly what the hierarchy of the report's going to be and what you want printed out and when. So that's the idea of report structure. These red dots that I've actually focused on kind of unconsciously here are representing those control blocks that we had in the BDL code that we saw a few minutes ago. So in the control blocks, you know, we were ordering by store number and order number. So that has created these report triggers that we can use to tell the report exactly what we want to occur when the store number changes or the order number changes in these examples. Then we have this on every row trigger as well, and typically that's where we'll have our table row, where we're printing out a row of information from our extracted data, a record of extracted data. The branch nodes control how the child nodes are laid out. You can change the hierarchy of the objects. You can drag and drop these nodes around in the structure view so that the hierarchy's changed and you get a different report essentially the next time it prints out. So you can drag and drop them wherever you like in that structure view to change what happens when the report runs. And the structure view actually reflects the actual XML structure in the .4RP file. Having a hard time with that for some reason. So that's what the XML actually looks like if you were to open up that report design document file and look at it. And here's the properties view. I guess I forgot the properties view. I thought we'd already looked at it, but no. Here's the properties view. And just like we talked about with Form Designer, when we had our session on Form Designer, we have properties for Report Designer objects as well. So just about everything you place in its main work area has properties assigned to it. And when you select an item in the work area, it's going to show the properties for that particular item in the properties view. And here's an example here, the store num value. And you can see there's a lot of properties associated with that you can change if you want to. So just about every object you place in the work area has all kinds of properties that you can edit. And again, just like the toolbox, you can see that properties is also arranged in groups. And again, the most commonly used groups kind of towards the top of the properties panel. Just a quick second here. If we look here at what they've selected to edit, and notice that you can edit by going out here and just editing the value directly, which you could do right here. You have this red return arrow. So let's say you make a mistake while you're editing. You can put it back to the defaults by clicking that red return arrow. And then this FX button allows you to actually enter an expression called an RTL expression. So you can actually specify what the output of a data element or any element looks like by using one of these RTL expressions. You can use arithmetic formulas, you can use conditionals like if, then, else statements, program variables, functions and methods. For example, you see people use these to trim strings, right? It'll actually convert a character data element to a string so that you can use the trim method if you want to. So you can use methods with these. All different kinds of things, and then these get evaluated at runtime. So the idea here is kind of an intermediate representation of what a data item, for example, will look like when the report actually runs at runtime. So it's based on the input it gets, the expression that you use, and then it will actually create the output at runtime. So it kind of, I guess, manipulates or massages the value based on the expression that you put in. There's a whole section, by the way, in the documentation on using RTL expressions and some of the things you can do with them. A few more pages here. Grab my highlighter. There's actually two types of report settings that you can only get to through a menu, and this is one of them, the paper settings. So from the File menu option, you can go to Report Properties and then Paper Settings to configure the paper settings that you want to use for your report design. So the defaults are here. Notice, of course, default is Portrait for the orientation, but you can specify Landscape. You can specify the units of measure. Default centimeter, but you can change it to inches if you prefer. Page size format lets you pick from standard sizes, and there's a lot of standard sizes here that you may not normally see in an application. We support all kinds of special sizes you might just see, for example, in Europe. Or you can even customize your page size if you prefer. So you can create a custom page size format. And then down here at the bottom, you can adjust your margins, top and bottom, left and right margins. And again, if you're not happy with what you've done, there's an option down here to reload the defaults. So if you mess up, it's not a big deal. You can just start over. So that's the report settings for the report you're designing. And I said there was two things, so this is the second thing that you set for your report design through menu options. The output configuration is the second thing. So where do you want the finished report, the formatted report, to go? The default there is SVG, or it's been set to SVG in this case. So you can specify your output format here. You can specify here whether or not you want to use anti-aliasing, that's a hard word to pronounce. The idea for that is smoothing out like jagged lines you might see. You see that sometimes when your output device doesn't have a high enough resolution. So by default, that's actually already turned on to try to smooth out any jagged lines. But sometimes it can make your reports look a little fuzzy. So if you want to, you have the option to turn that off. So it will not do anti-aliasing, hard word to say. If you are using PDF or image formats instead of SVG up here, you can specify monochrome for your color values instead of color. You can specify a page range that you want to output. If you're printing out to a printer, for example. If you're saving the report to an image format, you can specify the type of image. The default for that, by the way, is JPEG. And you can also specify the prefix name for the image, and the default for that is your standard IMG prefix. But of course you can change that from here. So there's your report output config. So that's a pretty brief summary of all the components of Report Writer, and we went through the basics of creating a 4GL report. Has your BDL to extract the data and send it to the report block to be output. And we've also seen the basics, very basics, of creating a report design with Report Designer and how to configure the paper settings and output configuration by using the menu options. So there's a lot here that we haven't covered. So of course there's all kinds of documentation to help you with that. You can always use the Help button in the toolbar. You can also use F1 to access online help. You can go to the Start menus and go to Studio, and Studio has help as well that you can use. And you also have a support area on our website that's got a lot of tips and tricks, I guess you could say. In the frequently asked questions area, there's a section on Genero Report Writer there that may give you some tips and tricks there that you might not find in the documentation. So I believe that's all of the actual slides for the presentation. Yep. So let me just take a few minutes and show you some of these things in Studio that we've been talking about. So over here is my project view, and you can see that I've created a project workspace for reports. I've also got some special nodes here. I've got an application node for my list report with a couple of virtual folders I've created. One for the report designs, like we saw in the example in the slides, and then a separate virtual folder for my source, my 4GL programs. And again, there's a lot of ways you can do that, but it just is easy to see this way where your report designs are versus your actual BDL code to extract the data and format the data. So over here, in my editor, I've got a report pulled up here. Here's my report main, just so that we can see an actual 4GL that we've created. Here we've got our variable set up for our SACS document handler. That's our XML handler object that we'll be creating to create the XML data stream. This report is actually going to extract data from a database, so we have our database statement. Here's one of these mandatory report API functions to load the settings from a particular report design document. And I've gone ahead and already typed in the name of a report that I thought I might real quickly create, just in the interest of saving a little time. Now, of course, in real life, you probably don't want to go in and edit the name of the report every time you want to run the program. So you would either have multiple BDL programs, one for each report, or you can do what a lot of people do and just pass that in as a variable. It doesn't have to be hard-coded like this. So there's better ways to handle it. But here, just simply, we're going to type in the name of the report. So I'm going to create a report design called CusList here in a minute real quickly, just to show you how to move around in Report Designer. And then we're going to commit the current settings from that report design document to create our XML handler. And then, providing it returns a true from that commit current settings function, then we're going to go ahead and call our report driver, right? A function that contains our report driver. Run store list to handler. Now that function is actually in a separate 4GL module. So here we're taking a look at it. It's called cuslist.4gl. So here's the schema statement, because again, this report will extract data from a database. Here's our user type definition, just like we talked about in our session, our PowerPoint session. This one we're just creating a record, report 1 data record is our user type with just customer information and state information, but it's all columns from each table, customer.star, state.star. And then here's our report driver, run store list to handler. So here's our user type that we defined. Here's our XML handler object that we're passing in a reference to into the function. And again, since we're extracting data from a database, our driver has the SQL in here to declare a cursor, and then we're using that cursor to select and extract data from the database. So we're extracting everything, all the columns, from customer and state, and then we're ordering it by state code and then by store number. And we're sending that data here to the report block. So as we use that cursor and traverse the database table, every record, we're sending one record at a time to our report block. And then right down here below it is our report block, report 1 report. Here's our user-defined data type reference here, our variable for that. And this is just telling the report how the data was sorted, right, or how it was ordered. State.stateCode, customer.storenum. And then here's our format section. Very simply, on every row, print the record. So a very simple example. So let me remind myself what the name of my report should be, since I've already pre-named mine, CusList. Let's just look real briefly at Report Designer. So I can go up to File, New, and in my Reports category, there's actually a template for list reports. I'm just going to use this template because, again, it saves a lot of time. Don't want to use too much of your time. So here's my report template. You can see that some of the basic report structures have already been put in for me. For example, the page root mini page that we discussed earlier is already in place here. And notice when I click around inside the main work area, you can see that it's highlighting specific objects. And as I highlight those objects, it's also selecting those objects here in the report structure view as well. And I can do it the other way. I can select an object in report structure, and it will automatically select that object in the main work area. So either way will work to select the object in both places. So let's just real quickly create a very simple report design just to show you how to get started. I'm going to go to my data view, and notice when I click on the data view, it comes up, instead of showing me all my data elements from my 4GL BDL program I created, it says your report is not yet associated to a schema. Open schema file. So what it's asking for there is that special .RDD file that we discussed a couple of times when we were going through the session. So I'm going to click on that, and of course when I compiled my 4GL, the module that had the report block in it, I had already added the compiler options in there to go ahead and create this RDD file automatically. And I'll show that to you in just a second. I meant to do that. But here it is. I've got a CusList RDD file that I'm going to select. And now I can see all the data items in my data view. So there's my data items. And I mentioned earlier that we've got these icons across the top here. And anytime we get ready to select an item from the data view and drag and drop it into the report main work area, you need to specify what type of object you want to drag and drop. You've got all these options. Create a form field value object, right? So if you're working with data from a file, you can use that option to tell it you want to actually drag and drop the file element value. Versus, if I pick the next option, create a form field title object. So this will be just a header, for example, a caption or a header. The next icon over creates a table column value object. So this is when we're using data extracted from a database table. So these are the options we'll be using for our little sample report here. And then the next one is create a table column title object. a header, right? A column header, for example, is the way I think of that. And then finally, the last icon, create a table column value object for a column without a title, right? So if I'm not using titles, that will go ahead and size the value appropriately based on just the length of the column or the size of the column. So let's grab some data elements out of here. Make sure I grab the right. Okay, so I want this one here. Create a table column value object. So I'm going to select that, and then I'm just going to go out here and select some data items that I want in my report. Now, where am I going to place them? I want to put them in a container. So again, I've used a template, which makes things a lot easier for me with a simple list report. I can go over here and select table row. That's where I want these to actually be placed, as inside of a container that's going to hold my rows of table data as they're printed out. So I highlight that, and there's a couple of ways that I can drag and drop items to it. I can drag an item from over here in the data view and drop it. Now notice when I'm dragging it that I've got the red circle. When it's got the red circle, that means I'm using something called specific positioning, they call it. And that means that when I turn loose of my mouse button, it's going to just save that or place that object exactly where I put it when I drag it over to the main work area. Now you would use that type of drag and drop specific positioning for things maybe like creating a report to print out labels, right? You want to be very specific about where a field is placed when you're printing out labels. But for what we're doing here, I think I would prefer to use dynamic layouting, which means I'm going to let Report Designer actually format my data elements on the report, and it's going to do that based on the size of the data item so that it can make sure that there's enough room in the report for all the data values or captions. And it actually figures out which is bigger, right? The caption, like the name of the column, for example, with table data, or the value, and it will create enough space appropriately, whichever's bigger. So I'm going to get rid of this because I don't want to use specific positioning. I'm just going to roll that back, and then I'm going to drag and drop it again, but this time I'm going to use dynamic layouting. So to do that, I can grab my data element and hold the Control key down and then drag it over. And you can see there's a red line that appears over to the left there that tells me where that data element is going to be snapped to, or that data item will be snapped to when I release the mouse. So if I turn it loose using dynamic layouting, it's going to pop over to where that red line appeared. So I can just keep dragging and dropping items this way. So I'll grab another one here, store name, drag it over. Make sure I hold down the Control key so I'm using dynamic layouting, and turn it loose. And it'll lay it out across there based on the width of those columns. Now, a faster way to do it, I think, is to go over here in the Report Structure view. And if I click on my container, in this case the table row container that I want to add these data items to, I can highlight it and then go over here to my data view and just double click on things. So let's add the city. Notice it's kind of hard to see, but it automatically placed that city out there for me. Notice it added it here to the report structure view on the right-hand side. Let's add state. I'll just double-click that, and zip code. And now I've got, let's say, everything I want in my report. Now, it looks like it was too much data to fit on my report because you can see it's kind of wrapped around here and started using up an additional line. I don't really like that, so let's go up and change our properties. So if I go to File, Report Properties, like we talked about in our session today, and go to Paper Settings, I can change it there from Portrait to Landscape. So I'm going to do that. And notice now it doesn't wrap around. Everything fit nicely on that one line. So that looks a little better to me. So now I've got my for each row, right, for every row type data, but I'd like to have some column headers, right, some captions. So I can go right up here to the table header node in my report structure. And notice when I select that, it automatically selects this header area at the top of the page. So now I'm going to add some column headers, right, or some titles to my report. So I need to go up here to these icons and select a different icon. So I have been using create a table column value object, and now I'm going to move over to the next icon and create a table column title object. So I'm going to select that. And now I just want my headers, my titles. So I'm just going to use that same method we just talked about and just double click. So there's store num, store name. I think the next data item I added was customer.city, state, and zip code. So now you can see I have my titles. So that looks pretty good. Maybe the last thing I want to do as far as designing my report, my list report, is maybe change the title here. So to change the title, I actually need to change the properties. So notice it's already selected the report title here in the report structure, but I don't have my properties view here, my properties pane. So I'm going to go to Window, Views, and look for Properties. There's Properties. I'm going to add that. So there's the properties. And if I scroll down through my properties for my report title, notice it's a Word box. It's the type of object that it used. I can scroll down until I find the text. Report title here. Click on that, and I'll just call it, whoops, if I can spell, I'll call it Customer List. There we go. So that changed my report title. So there's just a few ideas of how you move around in the report structure view and the properties view and drag and drop items onto the report work area. Now before I actually run the report, I still need to do a few things. One thing is I need to give the report a name. Notice it still says it's untitled report name. And the other thing I need to do is adjust it or kind of integrate my report in the report structure view. I need to tell it exactly what I want to happen when I report, when my report gets formatted and printed or saved. So what I really want to do here is go ahead and print out, let's say, all my customers, all my stores on a single page. So to do that, remember this page root represents our basic report page. I'm going to go ahead and just drag this state code down. There we go. And move the page root up to the top, right? So I have this page of my report and then all my data printed out on that page. Something else I need to do here is I need to go ahead and let me close out this properties view so we can see everything. I've got my table row here with all my defined values I want to see, but I need to add it down here to my on every row because I want to see a row of data printed out for every record sent across. So I'm going to move that table row down below and make it a child of on every row. So I believe we're in good shape. Right, so we've got, looks like we've got our structure the way we want it. Now I need to rename my report. And if I remember right, I wanted to call it Cust List because I had already created a 4GL that used that name. So let's call it that. custlist.4rp, and it wants to know where I want to store that. Remember, we actually created a nice project structure so that we have our designs in a different area here than our actual source code. So I'm going to put it here under Designs and save it. And now we should be good to go, providing I did the report structure view correctly. Sometimes I kind of goof that up and have to try again, but we'll see. So over here in Projects view again, let's go ahead and see if I got everything done that I should have. Let's just try to run that list report now. And it looks like it worked okay. Sometimes I miss something, right? There's a lot of little things to remember when you first start working with the report writer and report designer. And if you don't work with it a lot, sometimes it's difficult to remember all the details. But there's my simple customer list report. There's my column headers or my captions up at the top. There's my report title, customer list. And it looks like I had enough data to fill up more than one page. So up here at the top, notice we're using SVG for our output type. So we're using Report Viewer to view the output. And you can use the blue arrow there to look at the next page. So it also has some data on a second page. All right, so let me close that out. Let me just check, make sure I don't have any questions. Okay, we're good. I always like to double check right about now and just make sure there's not any questions about what we've already done. All right, let me get that out of the way. Now, we talked about the report structure view a bit, so let me just tell you that one thing I could do here and create a almost completely different look and feel. In fact, Chris has a question. He says, what would you do to put each state on a different page? Which is a great question. In fact, I was going to show you that. Thank you for the segue, Chris. Right here, I've actually already changed up my report a little bit to do that. Right? I want the stores from each state to be on a different page. So I can do that by rearranging my report structure view, right? Moving these nodes around. Specifically, I want to move my group state code, right? If I want to cause the page to a new page to be printed out every time the state code changes, I need to move it up the report structure above the page root. So let me just show you what that looks like. Close this guy. There we go. Here's another report that is almost exactly the same, right? It uses the exact same BDL. There's no change to the 4GL part, just a slight change to the report structure. Let me open everything up so you can see it. Not that you really need to for this, but all I did was move this group state code trigger up above the page root node so that now everything's based on a change in state code. So when there's a change in state code, or when that specific trigger gets executed, then we're going to have a new report page created, page root. And then down below, we still have, after we break out the page by state code, we're ordering the data by store num, and then we're still printing out a row of data on every row. We're printing out the record. So good question. And that's all you have to do is just move things around, in this case, so that the state code group, that trigger, was up above the page root node. And if we run that report, I'll have to make a quick change here because my report's not very fancy. I'm not passing in the name of the report design document as a variable. I have to actually change it here in my main. So it was called cust list by state. Right? Cust list by state. And let's just run it again. Same BDL, we're just using a different design. See if it finished. There we go. So now notice it looks a lot different. We have 3 pages to the report. And if I use my arrows, there's report 2, or page 2 of the report. So I see my Illinois customers, and then I see my Wisconsin customers. So a very simple change. All righty. So pop this report back up there just to show you. There's the first one, right, where we had all the customers on a single page, and then just by dragging this page root down, just being a little bit stubborn. Sometimes I have to jiggle it a little bit to make it work. Jiggle, jiggle. Being stubborn. There we go. More than one way to skin a cat, right? That's a terrible expression. I don't know who invented that expression. All right. So that's the idea anyway. Now then, just making sure this was clean. There we go. There we go. Anyway, you can move them around to your heart's content. I still didn't get this the way I wanted it, but you get the idea. All right. So it's fairly simple to do. You just have to be persistent till you actually get it to do what you want it to do. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay. Well, we did take about a little over an hour and a half today, but I guess for our last session, maybe it should have been a little longer than usual. So thank you very much. I know some of you have attended every session, which I think is just great. Hopefully it won't be long till we'll do another webinar, maybe not a whole series like today, but we're discussing maybe having these on a regular basis in the future. And if we decide to, you'll certainly get an email or an announcement on some of the forums that we've been using to advertise them. So thanks everybody for attending today, and hopefully I'll see you soon in another webinar session. Thank you.